morning and welcome to Radio Friends on Thursday, November the 28th. This is Thanksgiving, and we're very thankful that you chose to spend at least 8 or 9 minutes with us this morning. And Larry Brown.
Yes, we are, thank you.
Yeah. Happy Thanksgiving, Larry.
Same to you.
Now, I see you don't have your guitar with you.
No.
Which means that today you're wearing the Storyteller hat.
Storyteller hat, and this is almost Storyteller/Professor hat today.
Oh, okay. So we have a Thanksgiving story, but as true to what Larry does, he never tells me ahead of time what his story is going to be.
Actually, I'm going to tell you the title this time.
Oh, okay.
I know this is totally out of character, but the title is Tisquantum, the Last of the Patuxet.
Tisquantum, the Last of the Patuxet.
Yeah, Patuxet.
Patuxet.
Yeah, Patuxet.
Patuxet.
Yeah.
Okay, whatever. Okay, tell us about the Patuxet.
Well, in the 17th and 16th century, North America was the subject of European colonialism. And they were just focusing on harvesting the resources, particularly fish and cod, and then also furs. And, of course, they were bringing disease, but they were bringing such significant change to the North American continent in those 2 centuries with their political and economic adventures. Well, of course, there were people living there, and among the folks there were a number of groups in the Eastern Algonquin family, a language family. They were semi-nomadic people. They had seasonal villages. Sometimes they would be at the coast, sometimes inland. But they were agriculturalists. They grew maize, corn, other vegetables. In fact, we know now that less than 10% of their diet was actually animal protein. So they were sophisticated farmers. But, of course, the coming of the Europeans shifted all that. They were trading their goods amongst each other, intertribal trade, but now all that trade was shifting and going back to Europe, particularly the cod and the furs. And now there were rivalries among those groups. So before they traded friendly with each other, and now they were competing with each other to get the European trade. There were a number of attempts that the English made to establish permanent settlements there on the coast. And I think the first attempt was 1601, when they tried to get a settlement on what's today the coast of Maine. And they were, unfortunately, they were also capturing people. There was what I called kind of the hospitality trick, that they would invite them onto the ships to trade, and the next thing you know, they'd captured these folks, and they became then enslaved and eventually were shipped back to Europe. And in 1605, there were a group of 5 Native Americans that were captured into slavery by George Weymouth. But there was some interference with some Spanish vessels, and some of these young men escaped and made their way back to the continent. And among them was this one young man named Tisquantum, whom will feature more prominently in history just a few years later. But in the meantime, there were other ships coming all the time, and in 1614, Captain John Smith, who would become famous later in early colonial history, and Thomas Hunt brought 2 ships, and they too had captured some young men. And Thomas Hunt, in fact, had captured a group of 27 young men, and among them again was the same young man, Tisquantum. This time he was taken all the way back to Spain, was sold to a group of monks, then later was sold to a man in London. So he spent about 4 years in Europe, and he learned the English language, and then was passed on to someone else to serve as an indentured person on a ship going back to North America. Now hold that thought for a moment, because the years 1617 to 1619 were just devastating to Native Americans all along that coast. Diseases like smallpox and yellow fever and even the plague, such that there were tens of thousands of people, but 2 years later there were hundreds of people. Entire villages were just decimated, laid waste, vacant. Well, this young man, Tisquantum, was able to go back to where his home was and discovered that he was the last of his group. His entire village, his band of folks were wiped out. So hence he was the last of that particular group. Well, because he spoke English, was handed over to another group of Native Americans called the Patuxet. And they wanted him because he would be helpful in negotiating trade deals because he could speak English. And he was taken in with this other group. At that time, the leader of of a confederacy was a man by the name of Massasoit. And so Tisquantum became a valuable commodity because he could communicate back and forth. Now we've set the stage for, we all know what happened in November of 1620, now almost 400 years ago. And that was the coming of the Puritans to that same area. Initially, they were stranded in the Cape Cod area, and that first winter was horrible. They wound up raiding, actually, food deposits they found buried in some of these abandoned villages. It was a desperate time. But there they met this young man, Tisquantum, who was of some assistance. And particularly next spring, he helped them learn the agriculture of the indigenous peoples, growing maize, growing corn, and other ways of dealing with that environment. Well, he became very important then as a negotiator between the Puritans and the Native American groups. Now, there was a man named William Bradford who would eventually become the governor of that area, who had taken a personal interest in Tisquantum and had used him to mediate some conflict going on. The Puritans were aligned with the Patuxet, and they were fighting the Narragansett, another group. And so he was running shuttle diplomacy between these two groups. But unfortunately, in 1622, this young man died of a fever, and Governor Bradford wrote about him. Governor Bradford kept referring to him with a shortened form of his name that would be more familiar to us, Squanto. Squanto, the legends then continued to persist after that, how he'd been the primary person to help the Pilgrims survive. There was a controversy at one point. They thought he was getting a little too sophisticated in using his status. But by and large, the legends continued, and even language like he was sent by God to save the Puritans. But that's the story of Tisquantum.
All right. That's a good story for Thanksgiving Day. Larry Brown, thank you so much for coming and sharing part of your day with us. If people would like to have your books or songs or
contact me at brownstory@hotmail.com. Just send me an email.
brownstory@hotmail.com. And you've got plenty of CDs, right?
Oh, well, I'll make whatever you want.
All right, you got it. We're out of time for today. I hope Thanksgiving Day is a pleasant one for you, and you can sit around the table and enjoy the company of the families, and maybe stay away from politics with the family. I know I have to. Tomorrow, Maria Trevor. Have yourself a nice day. Drop me an email, pepperpmissouri.edu. Bye-bye.